everyone, welcome back. My name is Diana. This is my channel Bookish Di, and today I am doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. So Kelsey over at the Fancy Hat Lady Reads had done this recently, and she had mentioned me for one of the questions, and I decided, one, thank you, Kelsey, and two, this is something I kind of wanted to do. It gave me a chance to think back on, how I became a fantasy reader and think about what do I like with fantasy books, as well as to think about some other things. So yeah, I decided to just do this one for fun. So this tag was originally created by the Book Pusher. It's an adaptation of a Get to Know the Romance Reader type or book tag. So yeah, let's get started. So the first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? How did you get to read your first fantasy novel? And this one was a little hard for me to answer just because I feel like I've always read fantasy, but I know that's not true. So the books that I read for a while growing up were like Nancy Drew books. So mysteries, I definitely read Animorphs. I was a huge Animorphs fan, but that's more science fiction. So I would say there are two ways I can answer this. So one is like technically probably my first fantasy book, but then the other is what actually got me started being a voracious fantasy reader. So the first one, what got me started, and I think this is really common for a lot of folks my age, like millennials, is Harry Potter, for better or for worse. And I had a friend in elementary school. I want to say this was between grades 3 and 4. And she had read the first two books and she was like, we should be wizards and you should read them. And I was like, okay. And my other mom moved in, and she at the time was working at Barnes and Noble. And so she could see, what fantasy, like what kids were reading, and that was Harry Potter. And so I got the first two Harry Potter books and I read them and I enjoyed them, but they weren't like, I'm not as attached to them as a lot of people my age are, which for me makes it easier to let them go now that JKR has let her turf flag fly free over recent years. I have fond memories of my mom reading them aloud to us, but that was not my primary point of entry for fantasy. That, I would say, is Alana the First Adventure by Tamara Pierce. So again, I got to these through my other mom, and she had suggested to her sister that she get me that my aunt get me the first two Alana books and the first two Dane books. And I read the Alana books and I was absolutely hooked. I loved the story of Alana disguising herself as a boy and learning to be a knight, and her story of meeting the goddess and meeting Faithful, and then just the continuing adventures in Tortal. And this is what got me hooked on fantasy more than anything else. Just the story of this girl who wasn't satisfied with what everyone was telling her her place should be. So she went out to fight to be the person that she wanted to be. And I loved the side characters. The villains were excellent. Looking back on it now, there are some things that don't age particularly well, especially with the third book, The Woman Who Rides Like a Man. Like, there's a lot in that book that just did not age well. But just these books hold a special place in my heart. And I was very much one of those kids who went from Tamara Pierce to Mercedes Lackey, and from Mercedes Lackey, I read so many other fantasy books, and it all comes back to me getting this book when I was 9 years old and just falling in love with the world Tamara Pierce has created. The second question is, if you could live in a fantasy novel or be the heroine of a fantasy novel, who would be the author and what trope would you want them to include? So this is tough because there are a lot of authors that I really love, but I think I'm going to go for Kate Elliott, and I think the trope that I would want her to use is getting together a crew for a heist. So I really enjoy Kate Elliott as an author. I think she is just absolutely amazing at what she does. Her world building is super interesting. She writes capable ladies. She writes really great relationships between characters and writes her characters in a way where you really understand her what their motivations are and what's driving them. And so I think if I was the heroine in a fantasy novel, her books would just be so interesting and just have so much in them that would be fun to live in. And I definitely think she could pull off writing a good heist plot and getting together a crew. And I think a heist written by Kate Elliott would be great. So that is what I want for this book, or for this question. Question 3 is, what's a fantasy that you've read this year that you want more people to read? And for me, that is The Four Profound Weaves by R.B. Lemberg. This is a novella I read at the beginning of the year, and I have not stopped raving about it since. So this is a desert fantasy following 2 elder trans characters, one of whom transitioned years ago, one of whom just transitioned, and the one who just transitioned, he's trying to figure out what he needs a name. And so he wants to go to Uzia's aunt to try and find a name. And Uzia wants to find her aunt as well to get additional lessons in how to create the 4 profound weaves. And the aunt sends them on a quest to the city of ER. And yeah, I adore this novella. It's just really hopeful. I really love the characters and the world building, and I want more people to read this. We are getting another book set in this world, I believe in 2022. Although that one is taking place like 1,000 years before the 4 profound weaves. But anyway, I loved this novella. Please read this novella. It's so good. It's so lovely. Question 4 is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what subgenre do you not read a lot of? So looking at the books that I've read, I would say my favorite fantasy subgenre is probably contemporary fantasy. So fantasy that takes place in the modern world. And this can include urban fantasy. But the reason I use contemporary fantasy is like not all of these fantasies take place in cities, and they don't always have the tropes of an urban fantasy. Anyway, I really like the integration of magic and magical creatures into modern day life. And I like the different paths this might take. So sometimes it's like alternate history, like with Elatsoe, which I just read for my September, or which I just talked about for my September wrap up. Sometimes it might be something similar to the October Day books or the encrypted books, where there have always been magical creatures silently living alongside us. Or it could be something like Rebecca Rowan Horse's Sixth World, where magic suddenly like people suddenly become aware of magic and just the consequences of it. So I really like that genre and just the tropes that come with it. And I would say the subgenre that I don't really read much is grimdark. I'm not interested. I like hope in my fantasy, and I don't like a lot of grittiness or like grimness for the sake of grimness, and how a lot of that kind of shows up in the form of sexual violence. And I don't want to read it. I don't want it in my life. So I don't read it. I don't touch it. Question 5 is, who is one of your auto-buy authors? And this should come as no surprise. That is Shauna McGuire. I have been reading Shauna McGuire for almost 10 years now, and I just love the different worlds that she comes up with and the different genres that she writes in. So I pretty much own most of what she's written at this point. There are a few things that I don't have, but I own most of them. The October Day series is one of my all-time favorite series. I've talked about it at many points in time. I'm currently rereading the series with my friends Renee and KJ for Fangirl Happy Hour, and kind of talking about how McGuire has laid the groundwork with these books in terms of like the long-term plotting. So yeah, Shauna McGuire, auto-buy author, love her stuff so much. Question 6 is, how do you find fantasy recs? And I would say for me, it's a lot of word of mouth. So it'll be what my friends are reading. So like the Unspoken Name, which I read in September, that I found out about through some friends, and that's how I picked it up. Other times I'll find things out from Twitter. I follow a number of authors and publishers, and so I'll see, what publishers what they're putting out. I see what authors that I like are talking about with fantasy books, and so those will go on my TBR. So that's mostly how I find books right now. Question 7 is, what's an upcoming release that you're excited about? And that is The Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the sequel to her book, Black Sun, which I read last year and absolutely loved. It was one of my favorite books of 2020, and it ended on a cliffhanger, and I need to know what happens with the characters. And so we're getting The Fevered Star in April 2022, and I am so excited to find out what's going to happen. And I cannot wait. I'm very nervous for several characters, but I think based on what was set up in the Black Sun, it will be very, very interesting. Hi, Leia. You gonna come join us? Question 8 is, what is one misconception of about fantasy that you would like to lay to rest? And that is, there is more to fantasy than what our fantasy tells you to read. So please move beyond your Brandon Sandersons, your Steve Ericksons, your Joe Abercrombies. Please read something other than white dudes, because they exist and they're writing much better stuff. So yeah, that is the misconception that I would love to lay to rest, is that only white dudes write fantasy worth reading. Question 9 is, if someone had never read fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that came to mind, what would they be? So this one, I'm gonna have to try and I'm gonna adjust the question a little bit. So I think because there's so much range with fantasy, I would want to get to know the preferences of who I'm talking to first, like what other media they enjoy, to give them good recommendations. Like if they enjoy more romance, giving them more fantasy romance recs. If they like superheroes, giving them some books that are along the same vibes. So for this time, I'm gonna say, like, someone is coming to not having read fantasy, but has seen things like Game of Thrones, like The Witcher, or the upcoming Wheel of Time adaptation, and wants some epic fantasy recs because they haven't really read anything in the genre before. So for me, the 3 epic fantasy recs I would give in this instance would be The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. This is for, like the epic scale of those types of works. So this is the first in an epic fantasy trilogy. This particular book stars a young girl, Yena, who is called to the center of the 100,000 Kingdoms because her mother used to be a member of the ruling family before she left. And Yena is being called by her grandfather to contend for the throne. And when she gets there, she discovers that there are some gods enslaved by her maternal family, and they are drawing her into their scheme. So I think this would fit like the more epic nature of those types of shows, and also has a very it's very focused. However, there's only one point of view character per person or per book. So I think that might help with kind of the overwhelming feeling that epic fantasy can have at times. I would also recommend The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. This would be for the more political machinations. So this book is centered on a half goblin, half elf named Maya, whose father and 3 older brothers die in an airship accident, and suddenly he is now emperor. And so he has to take over the kingdom, as well as find out, was this an accident or was it murder? And this is just I love this book so much. This is just one of my favorite books of all time. So I'd recommend this more for like the political aspect. So politics is an important component, and this also, I think, is a very kind book, which I think might be something different than what people are expecting with epic fantasy. So I think that might be another reason why I'd recommend it, because it's not just grim and dark. There is a lot of hope in this book, and I think Maya as a character is just, he's very different than other epic fantasy protagonists, and I think that might be a reason people might enjoy this book. And then the last book I would recommend is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is an epic fantasy based on pre-Columbian Americas, and I would recommend this because, one, it has multiple points of views. So for someone who comes in from like Game of Thrones, where you do have all these different point of view characters, this might simulate that. It also has a lot of magical creatures, which again might be of interest. And it's also just a very epic book and very well written. And I think people who might not be familiar with a lot of epic fantasy might enjoy this, especially because it just feels very different, but also it's very much in line with some of the epic fantasy genre conventions. The final question is, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you would like to shout out? And I would say for this, maybe Starla from Starla Reed. They're one of the creators that I just started watching fairly recently. I really enjoy their videos. We don't always have like the same taste with fantasy, but some of the things that they've talked about, like the Sword of Kaigan, that I hadn't really heard about, makes me very interested. So I think I would say them. So that is my Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you would like to do this one, please do so. If you have any thoughts about any of the answers I gave, please let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you see, please like and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.